hockey. Yeah.
My favorite.
It's Judd's Hockey Show.
And it is Judd's Hockey Show, which ordinarily involves yours truly, AJ Fredrickson, who you are looking at right there, and Jesse Pierce, as we find something from the off-season Wild related to talk about. But today we gave Jesse the week off, and age, it's because we are going to go back in time. Now, when were you born?
1997.
Oh God, you're young. Okay,
I know.
You were not even really a thought from your parents probably in the spring of 1993, when 2 years after making the Stanley Cup Finals, the Minnesota North Stars up and left, and you were born into a NHL-less community. But I will say this: you have probably zero recollection of anything before the Wild, correct?
Correct.
You don't remember anything. There'd be nothing from because you would have been like 2 or 3 years old.
The closest thing I have to any interaction, live viewing of Minnesota North Star stuff was when the Stadium Series game was at TCF Bank Stadium, and they had the North Stars like alumni game, but that was the closest thing. So like you said, I was born into a state of hockey with zero hockey.
So so in other words, the North Stars are to you what the Minneapolis Lakers were to me, which is you've heard the stories, you don't, but you certainly didn't see them play, didn't come close. So what we're going to do today, and hold on a second, because I'm going to introduce our guest, and then we will pop him on the screen. Dan Geisbauer. Now you're saying, who's Dan Geisbauer? If you follow Twitter, if you follow Minnesota sports, especially the bad and the good, you know Dan as Dan Whenesota, which is something that he launched. We'll talk to him about that a few years back. Now, his main claim to fame, if you know him, is probably his books as well. History of Heartbreaks. Yes, that's right. Shockingly, 100 events that tortured Minnesota sports fans came out a couple of years back. And then more recently, a magnificent book called A Slapshot in Time, the wild but true history on the Minnesota Fighting Saints, a team that I don't recall. They actually were playing in what was called the World Hockey Association in the 70s at the St. Paul Civic Center. So I was around. I was just not yet into the sport. But please bring on Dan, because Dan is going to talk about his most recent project, which is a documentary film on the Minnesota North Stars, which is fantastic. It's full of information. I consider myself a hardcore North Star fan that I did not know. It's great stuff. Dan, welcome to the show. And first of all, your background is absolutely great. I see a Kicks pennant. I loved the Kicks.
I was trying to find the right angle for the camera there for
Dude,
so
it's great.
Get the Fighting Saints one in there too. And
so who else is back there? I see the Timberwolves. I see
that's that
Lakers.
Timberwolves inaugural poster from the first season.
Yep. Nice. Okay, I see.
You got my clothes in the.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. I got a pile of clothes
shelf there.
right here. I got bobbleheads. No apologies. Before we get into your most recent endeavor, Dan, in the North Stars film, I want to ask you about the genesis of how you started, because I think it's fair to say that you have become pretty well known as a Minnesota sports historian, more so on the unfortunate than the fortunate. But and I know that you do God's work. You teach school, which, by the way, thank you for that. I'm sure in this day and age, that's not a simple task. But how did you sort of get into this, especially being published, where you said, you know what, there's a sweet spot here. Unfortunately, it's a spot of a lot of sports torture. What was the genesis of that introduction for you into this?
Well, to be honest, most of this stuff it kind of fell into my lap. I never wanted to be a writer. I never wanted to be an author. Just your years of Minnesota sports angst build up, and you just become, bitter and jaded. And at some point you just have to start looking at things through a humorous lens. You can't I don't know. High blood pressure, man. You get so worked up during a game, and we're lining up for that last minute field goal. You're watching through your eye. At some point, you gotta find a way to cope with that, and just realize it's not real life. And back in, I think it was 2016, ESPN 30 for 30s, they released Believe Land, and Believe Land is the story of how heartbroken and how bad Cleveland sports fans have had it over the years. So Believe Land, they kind of outline their case for being the most heartbroken with they have these listed events. They have them by name: the trade, the shot, the fumble, and they kind of lay out their case. And as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, well, gosh, Minnesota has an event that kind of rivals each one of those, if not even worse. You know, they talk about the fumble where Ernest Biner fumbles on the goal line in the AFC Championship game. Well, that exact same day was the day that Darren Nelson fumbled on the goal line in the NFC Championship game. They talk about the trade of Rocky Colavito being like the worst in history. How can you even argue trades with a Vikings fan? We got Herschel Walker. It's the worst trade in the history of all sports. It's been documented. Okay, so I'm sitting here watching this, and I'm kind of getting riled up by this, and I'm like, what's going on? And then here's the worst part. During the documentary, they put up a photo of the Gunn brothers with a North Stars flag behind them, because the Gunn brothers in Cleveland are viewed as heroes for saving the Cleveland Cavaliers from the evil owner Ted Stepien, who had traded away all their draft picks and kind of ran the franchise into the ground. Yep. And for a while, the arena was named Gunn Arena, but the Gunns also owned the North Stars. So and they tried to move the North Stars to San Jose. So now I'm like really angry, right? So I actually started it out as a letter. I wrote a letter to the director, Andy Billman, laying out my case as a rebuttal to him, laying out all of our events and things like that. And it kind of turned into my own mockumentary, which I figured I'd play off of the Believe Land name. And I came up with Whenesota, because when's it going to be our turn? You know, at the beginning of their movie, they say like some fact, like of all the teams with 4 major sports teams, Cleveland is the longest to not have a championship. Well, they won the NBA championship in 2018. Guess who's next on that list? Okay. So I came up with this film called Whenesota, and like just a mockumentary, so to speak. And it's on YouTube, my original one. And we had like a viewing in the garage. We invited family and friends. I got like monogrammed cups. We had popcorn, and I made like fancy tickets for everybody just to have some fun. Right. Mm-hmm. Well, one of my friends suggested to me, like, you know, because I wrote in college, I wrote like just a fun nonsense column. I look back on them now, and I'm just embarrassed that I wrote just not like inappropriate things, but just bad writing. Right. But anyways, I had this column in college, and a friend said, you know, you should really start writing again, put together a website, and, you know, just start writing about Minnesota sports stuff. So I did. And one of the columns I wrote was, the Minnesota sports disappointment calendar. And I got that because, like, you guys probably follow Super 70 Sports Guy. He's awesome.
Oh yeah. He's phenomenal.
Like one day he posted the anniversary of Jim Marshall running the wrong way. And I was like, you know, somebody should really put together a list of all the bad things that have happened to us. And I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe that should be me.
Yeah.
Well, I put together this whole list, everything I could think of, you know, off the top of my head. And I can't always remember the dates anyway, so it's good to have a list and to be able to go back and refer to it like a little database now. My database is huge. But one morning, our friend Dan Barrero from a different media company, I won't mention, I don't want to get in trouble.
That's okay.
He was doing his show, and he said, what's your worst Minnesota sports memory? So I sent him the whole list. And like immediately he replied back to me. He's like, I want to start using this. And that became the Calendar of Calamity. And then some, you know, a book company reached out to me, and they're like, we want to put this together in a book. I'm like, is this real? Come on now.
So they reached out to you?
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't know
I had
that.
to like check with my attorney friend. I'm like, is this legit? Because I don't want to fall for some scam here and be buying like princesses in different countries and think, you know, what's going on here? Yeah. And so they reached out to me, and that first book became History of Heartbreak, with Dan Barrero writing the foreword on that one. And that came out in October 2020. Mm-hmm. October 6th, that actually was the release date, because that's the anniversary of the Vikings Love Boat cruise. We picked that specifically.
Remember it well.
Very nice. So that's how the book and the writing stuff started, and where my genesis as I guess if you're a superhero fan, Marvel superhero fan. Like every superhero has like a Genesis story. If I'm an evil superhero, that's my evil superhero story.
Yeah. Well, you're just acknowledging the truth of the fact that we have a lot of bad stuff that have taken place in sports. So fast forward now to your now completed multi-part series on the North Stars. How did that start? So how did you go from getting into the world or back into the world of writing and then take the step to documentaries? Because I would imagine there's similarities in research and stuff, but I mean, like, you now have to go get old highlights. I mean, I would guess that a documentary takes a lot more legwork than a research project that can be turned into a book, for instance.
Yeah, well, and the first one I used mostly, the Whenesota documentary, I used mostly like newspaper clips and photos that I could find, but you have yourself to blame for this North Stars documentary, by the way. This is your fault. If for those who didn't know this, it was the pandemic. It was spring of 2020. And everybody was looking for things to watch and recommending things to keep everybody sane during that lockdown time. And Judd had posted the California Seals documentary, which was really good. Great. And for those who don't know, the California Golden Seals are part of North Stars history. They eventually moved to Cleveland, and then Cleveland merges with the North Stars in the late 70s. But the documentary is great. But they were only around for 6 years, and I'm sitting there watching it. And, I guess deep down, maybe somewhere in my mind that someday I can become a real documentarian. So we're all sitting at home and I'm thinking, why isn't there a North Stars documentary? Well, I already made the Whenesota one. Why don't I make one about the North Stars? So my initial plan, I had no idea how long it would take me. My initial plan was to divide it into 4 parts. The 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, just keep it that simple. So the first part is called the Stars Born, and it's kind of a background of how hockey in Minnesota started, the original owners of the North Stars, how they got the franchise, the building of Met Center, that first season where they get like 1 double overtime goal away from going to the Stanley Cup final.
Right.
The second part I called Saints, Seals, and Barons because it involves the Seals moving to, like we just talked about, Cleveland and then merging with the North Stars. Yep. But it also involves the rise of the WHA as a competitor league to the NHL and thus the Minnesota Fighting Saints. And as I'm doing that whole part, I'm reading all these stories and going, oh my God, the movie Slapshot, we've all, if you're a hockey fan, you've seen it. Mm-hmm. It's outrageous. It's crazy. And we all quote the lines and rewatch it. But all those things really happened. Like, except for the strip tease at the end where Braden's like throwing his equipment.
Which, by the way, I don't enjoy. I think the end is no good. I agree. Film. I think the end is a disappointment. It should have just ended. It could have ended sort of sad. I don't care with the rest of it. Yeah. But the rest of it from the beginning, phenomenal.
Okay, and that's all true. All those stories really happened. Getting hit with a foreign tire iron, or all the Hanson brothers getting arrested. That really happened. So as I'm working on this North Stars documentary, and I'm kind of telling the side story of the Fighting Saints, it's like these guys kind of need their own story separate from this because I can't really go into everything here that needs to be told.
Right.
So that's where the Fighting Saints book came from, and I kind of took a break from the North Stars documentary while I was writing that. And then we got that out, and that came out, I think July 2022 was when it was officially released.
Yep.
And then I worked on the third part of the North Stars film, which is called what is it? Something We Can Taste It. So close we can taste it. I couldn't think of it.
And which was their line after the finals in 81.
Yeah, it was if you followed the North Stars, they had a different theme every year, like the Wild have It's Not Weird Wild or whatever, right? They have a different theme or ad campaign every year. Yeah, right. Our Ice, that was my favorite one.
Yeah,
it's not yours, it's ours.
Yeah, but that was their tagline that year because they were so close the year before of getting to the Stanley Cup final, and then they did and lost to the Islanders. And that one got long because it was like the 80s. There was so much and so many playoff highlights and things. So that part, this whole documentary is like 7 hours. Like if you watch it from beginning to end, it's 7 hours. Like the first part is a half an hour. Second part is an hour and a half. Third part is 2.5 hours. And this final part is called Good Night and Goodbye because Those were Al Shaver's last words on the last broadcast of the North Stars. And I had actually planned that beforehand, and he just recently died. So it was like, oh, it just hits even harder now.
Yeah.
But this final part, I feel like this final part can even maybe stand alone as its own film, even if you don't watch the first 3 parts.
I would agree. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, thank you.
It taught me, like, again, I lived that and I remember a bunch of it, but you had things unearthed that I had no idea about. So yeah, it's fantastic.
Well, that's a compliment coming from you because you remember everything. So, but yeah, it's 2 hours. The last 5 seasons, the changes in ownership, the Stanley Cup run with the Penguins, the kind of the dispersal draft where they have to lose half their team, kind of the divorce between the Barons and the North Stars, the final the rise of Norm, I should say,
yeah.
The eventual leaving, and I even cover the aftermath, like what happened after with the rumors of different teams coming in, the eventual birth of the Wild. And what happened to the land. That's kind of a big part for me, and the kind of, if you've seen it, you have seen it. The ending is kind of an important part to me. So that's kind of the story of it. And 4 years, man, it's 7 hours. And if you think about it this way, I kind of tried to, you do research, you're doing storyboarding, you're doing editing, you're doing narration, which I apologize for my voice, because I'm not a good narrator.
That's fine. No, it's good.
Think about how my students have to listen to it every day, so feel sad for them. But just all of that, how much, like 1 minute of edited video, how much time that takes, I estimate it's like maybe a half an hour to an hour to complete 1 minute of edited video. So if you take that times 7 hours of edited video,
your wife must be a saint, Dan.
She's a good woman.
She must be a saint. That is great. Now, I always ask people that have written books or done documentaries this question. Are there a few things that you unearthed in the research, found out, where you yourself were just like, wow, like you didn't know it, or it was just, because I mean, we all know things about teams, right? But I've always found that with people that delve as deep as you just did on this, that there's always a few wow moments from them, and it's always intrigued me what those were.
Yeah, there's a ton. I mean, there's the simple ones like the North Stars team fight in an Atlanta bar where there were arrests, and just little things like that are kind of fun to read about, But there's kind of 2 big ones. The first one is, in the late 70s, matter of fact, I think it was the 1979 NBA All-Star game. The NBA commissioner, Larry O'Brien,
this was interesting,
announced that they were going to expand. The NBA was going to expand, and they wanted 2 teams in Dallas and Minnesota, and they were encouraging those 2 cities to apply. And the Gunn brothers, who owned the North Stars at the time, did indeed apply. And they went to New York, met with everybody out there, but eventually they withdrew their application because they felt the expansion fee was too much. It was $12 million. They thought that was too much.
That's great.
3 years later,
they
end up buying their hometown team, the Cleveland Cavaliers. Again, we talked about saving them from Ted Stepien and all that, but it cost them $20 million. So it was actually more expensive. Then 3, 4, 5 years later, the NBA came calling to Minnesota again with Marvin Harv, who went to purchase the franchise. And at first they were negotiating with the Gunn brothers to possibly play at Met Center, but something happened in those meetings, and I don't know what it is, but they left both pretty much hating each other. Like something bad happened, and Sid kind of wrote about it a lot. And at first, the Gunn brothers said publicly they were going to vote against Minnesota getting an NBA franchise.
I vaguely recall that now that you mentioned that. I don't remember much of this, but I vaguely recall that they didn't want then this town to get a franchise.
Right. And I think eventually they did end up voting for them. But the whole point of this is once that the Timberwolves came and Target Center was built, that became a huge stress point for where the North Stars were going to play. If they were going to end up downtown at Target Center, because the Sports Commission wanted them to move downtown so they could sell the land and make the money off the land, and we're kind of forcing them out there. So it's a big, like, a couple things here. Had the Gunn brothers taken that expansion franchise, what if? Where would it be? And the other kind of unique thing is, where did the Dallas Mavericks end up playing? Reunion Arena, which is where North Stars eventually moved to. So just kind of a double sidekick to kind of think about those what ifs.
That's remarkable. So if the Guns had paid the expansion fee here, the 12 mil in 1980 when I was 10, and I don't recall that part at all at the time. Was the plan then to have the North Stars and the new NBA team be tenants of Met Center with the Sports Commission? Now, the Sports Commission, which we've texted about or DM'd about on Twitter a lot, the Sports Commission controlled that building. So, like, the Sports Commission plays a huge linchpin role in everything, correct? Because it wasn't the owners. The owners rented the building, certainly had some say in improvements, but they never ran the building.
So that's kind of the other big surprising thing that I found. And you guys have like a spoiler alert thing you should put on the screen or something during this, because we don't want to ruin it for everybody.
Spoiler alert right now.
So when the North Stars first got their franchise, the group that was putting it together, were looking all over. They needed a stadium that held at least 13,000, and there was no arena in Minnesota that existed at the time. So their options were to build a new one somewhere or to remodel one. And they were looking at possibly remodeling the St. Paul Auditorium, and they were looking at possibly building on the Met Stadium site. And because at first the St. Paul folks in the group were threatening to kind of break off and go present their own case to the NHL for their own franchise separate from the Minneapolis faction, they did that like a day before the presentation to the NHL governors. So they're like in panic mode here, right? So we got to make a compromise with these guys because a unified effort is better than a divided effort, right? So they said, okay, we'll go in with the plans to play at St. Paul Auditorium, even though it would still have to be voted on and it might not even pass. We'll go in and present that to the NHL Board of Governors. Well, the NHL Board of Governors said, I'm going to stop you guys right there. We want a new arena. And you're not getting a new franchise without a new arena. So they took like a break, went outside, and both factions agreed that they weren't going to get one unless they went with the plans at Met Center or at the Met Stadium site. So they went back in, got their franchise. But here's the kicker. That land was owned by the city of Bloomington, okay? The city of Bloomington has a clause in its, or did, in the village of Bloomington at the time, had a clause in its charter that said no private entity can own a building on its land. So these owners, and this is the really weird part too, is they paid, these 6-7 original owners, they paid out of their own money to build Met Center. How often do you see that today, right? Doesn't happen.
No.
Okay, so that's huge.
So it's privately funded.
Privately funded, okay? And then the minute it's done, they have to turn it over to the Sports Commission because of that clause for free. And then they had to pay rent there for 26 years. Now think about this in terms of you and I. You buy a house, you get through your closing, and the minute you're done with your closing, you have to turn it over to a landlord for free. And then you have to pay rent to live there for 26 years. What are your finances going to look like? You're not going to, I mean, you're talking about building equity and using that equity to maybe make improvements. And not only that, now you have to, if you have a landlord, you have to ask to do those improvements, which is what happened, and they refused them. So in my mind, the minute they made that decision, the clock started ticking. Right. Norm might have sped it up a little bit, but it may have been doomed from the beginning.
Well, and then it gets worse because 24 years or so after this, Target Center becomes a viable option until Marvin Harv, who privately funded the building themselves and were hemorrhaging, right? They told the North Stars, you can't have your advertisers on the dasher boards if they disagree. Like if we're Burger King, you're McDonald's, you're not. So like, perfect world, and the X is great, but perfect world, that's a seamless move to downtown and would have happened for sure, I think, because I think the league would have forced Norm just to go downtown, except for the fact that they also financially couldn't make money in that building. So it was really the ultimate, in my opinion, double whammy.
Yeah.
Your point, Target Center not available. What the heck are you supposed to do?
Yeah, if they'd have gone to Target Center, they would have been in just the same financial trouble because you're still paying rent. You're not getting any equity from that building. And the other thing is too, a year later, we find out that the financing for Marvin Harv is sketchy. I don't know if their loans were sketchy or just the financial crisis at the time, but they threatened to move a year later too. So it's like
they did move. The league's quashed it.
Yep. They were going to the famous picture of the Times-Picayune says we got him, Thank God they David Stern vetoed it. So
yeah. So on Norm, because he is, clearly to this day, especially people of our age, vilified, hated. When you went through all of this, like why they moved, and look, the sexual harassment plays a role. I think a lot of folks blame that completely. But when you went through and sifted through all of this, and a lot of the reporting is in your documentary, what was your takeaway on Norm Green at the end of the day? Not as a passionate North Star fan, but as a documentarian who tried to look at this, I think, probably through very clear lenses.
I went into this looking to nail him to the cross.
Of course you did. We all want to do that, Dan.
And after I first met with Louis like 3 or 4 years ago, I just, you go in with a narrative, and when you learn the facts, you have to change the narrative, right? Was he a bad dude? 100%. He just seemed like somebody that was difficult to work with. He would have been very frustrating to have to deal with on a daily basis. You're probably sitting in your office going, oh God, here he comes again. Don't make eye contact. Yep. He's that kind of a guy. But I honestly don't think it would have mattered who the owner was at the time, because the Guns went through the exact same thing with the sports commission. Norm and Howard Baldwin just bought him a few more years is all that happened. So was Norm an awful, I probably shouldn't say anything that's going to get me sued for slander here. Was he not the greatest human being? Probably not. But yeah, I mean, if you want to blame Norm, yes, he did move the team. He was the guy who moved the team, but I don't really think it mattered who.
I think you're right. I think it starts. So I was actually interning in PR for them in 89-ish. And I was, by the way, a terrible intern at 19. So I'm not going to try and tell you I was good at this. But I remember the day, it's weird, and I'm sure that you found this. USA Today broke the story of the Guns basically saying, you got to come, we need help or we're gone. And my personal contention has been from that day on, the team was doomed. The interesting thing, though, too, and this goes back to the merger with the Barons, the weird dispersal draft where the Sharks go to the Guns. How many things did you come across where you're like, none of this could happen today? Like this dispersal draft. Can you imagine a league now, a pro league? Can you imagine Gary Bettman now or the NBA or baseball doing this and saying, okay, here's the deal. We're going to split. We're basically going to split the baby, and you're going to get something from it. And this is coming off. The incredible thing, Dan, is this was coming off the Stanley Cup final season. So like this team is on the upper, this team is at its zenith and basically told, okay, you have a couple weeks, but you're going to lose a good portion of your prospect pool and some of your roster. Crazy.
On that one, you have to look at it too, that and you probably heard me say the divorce proceedings, because remember at one point they merged. So the North Stars did get a double minor league system, double the players and had to sift, so they had that opportunity at the time. So it really was an unending to this. I think for me, just the fact, like we just said, that the North Stars owners paid for the building. You don't see that today. It's, you need to buy us a new building or we're leaving.
Yep.
I mean, most municipalities, I talked to a friend of mine who used to be in the legislature, and he worked on some of the stadium stuff. I'm like, have you ever heard of this, that that owners will pay for their own building? And he's like, I've never heard of that. He didn't know that either. And it's like, I just think that's so bizarre that they were willing to use their own money to pay for it and then turn it over for free.
Yeah, well, that's the part. Like I've heard, like Marvin Harv built Target Center but they never had to, as far as I know, sacrifice the land or sacrifice the building. Then that's the incredible thing. I had no idea that they basically opened it and then had to give up the keys to their own house. That's an incredible.
Well, Marvin Harv bragged at first that it was going to be a publicly financed building, but within a couple of years they were asking for the buyout, which they got.
Yep.
And then sold the team anyways. But
yep.
So yeah, they bragged about it. It was going to be, but it wasn't. So that's
interesting. So, do you think that at the end of the day, and I will always miss the Stars personally because I loved them, but do you think at the end of the day that the National Hockey League in Minnesota would be better off if the North Stars could have found a way to stay, move downtown? I don't know, but let's just say they find a way to stay and eventually stabilize because somebody who was a billionaire by now probably comes along to buy them and can afford it. Or do you think that the direction that we went, which I think was 7 years without hockey here, pro hockey here, and then the Wild playing in a great building is actually a happier ending? What do you think?
Man, I don't know. I mean, the NHL got 3 franchises out of it, I was looking at valuations. Each one of them, they're all about the same. The Stars, the Sharks, and the Wild are all valued at $1.01 billion, I think. So they're all pretty equal. I mean, in terms of what the NHL wants, in terms of eyes and TV money and all that kind of stuff, I think 3 successful franchises are better than 1. But personally, I'm with you. I'm like, I wish they could have found a way to make my North Star stay,
Yeah, my only thing about that is, and I agree completely, my only thought has been they probably have to move at some point downtown, and that was an abysmal hockey building.
They would have needed a new stadium. I mean, somebody would have had to come in and say, we're like Norm Coleman, okay, we're going to build you the whole stadium here to get a franchise. We're going to do what we have to do. Somebody would have had to do that to keep them here. So I don't know who would that have been.
Did you find at any point, and this probably started hell in the 70s, for sure, I know that it was at least discussed informally in the 80s. Did you ever find that this team was a realistic threat to move to the Civic Center? They played a few exhibition games there.
Yeah, I found so many things where they were like at one point when Norm was talking about moving, like St. Paul, and I wish I could find footage of it. I found a newspaper clipping. St. Paul had a big, what do you want? Like a hockey party trying to draw the North Stars that way. And like apparently the mayor of St. Paul at the time made like a commercial trying to draw the North Stars over. And I've got photos of it, and I was going to put some of that in there, but it just started, at some point you got to edit stuff out.
Right.
But it came down, if I can remember right, it came down to like, they couldn't guarantee the number of seats Norm wanted or something like that. And they were hoping for like 8,000 to 10,000 to show up at this rally, and only like 2,000 did. And like, I think Norm got the key to the city too. They gave him the key to the city during that event. And
of course they did.
So, I mean, as you're reading through this, there's lots of, should the North Star, because Sid will put, Sid would put, I've heard the North Stars might put the move to, Civic Center. Right. There's all kinds of little rumors, but they never really kind of pan out.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of that. Yes.
Dan, you mentioned like, I'm sure amongst all of this, like within your research, you said you have to cut some stuff and whatnot. Was there any piece of info that maybe you wish you could have had a little more time, that you had to trim the fat off to just hit the real like meat and potatoes? Or is there something that you discovered or something that kind of branched off that you thought, you know what, this could be its own documentary book as is? Is there one of those topics that maybe you would love to branch out on, or something you had to cut that you wish could have made it in? Well,
obviously the Fighting Saints became its own side project, but there was, man, when Norm Coleman drove the Zamboni down the parade when they were celebrating the Wild, there's a photo of him on the Zamboni, and I couldn't get anybody to respond to me, and I was really bummed that got cut, because photos you have to get permission to use. Like video, you can claim fair use, but like photos I'm really leery about, because I don't want to use things that I don't have. I don't want to get in trouble with this,
Right.
I want it.
Absolutely.
And it's freely available. I'm not monetizing it or anything like that. But usually just certain photos that I can't find. There was one, we've since found the video. So the third part was the 80s, right? There's the game where Glenn Sonmore, I think it was the Bruins, where they beat the Bruins for the first time. Glenn Sonmore got a letter before the game from a White Bear Lake psychic that said he was gonna win the game against the Bruins and beat the Bruins at Boston Garden for the first time. But in the dream, he was wearing an eye patch. So Glenn Sonmore wore an eye patch for that game.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find, I'm scouring photos all over the place. I gotta find a photo of this. So I think eventually I just drew like an eye patch on him with like some graphic art. But since then, we've found footage of that game. And like, I think I can't remember who's calling the game, but they call him Long John Silver on the bench, and we've got video of it. And I wish I could go back and put that back in, because here's the video of Sonmore with the eye patch. So,
oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's the that's the win. So there was a huge brawl in Boston in March of '81.
This was the playoff one.
And then this is the first playoff game.
Yeah.
But what people don't recall is the huge brawl game, they lost as well. So from 1967, their inception until then, they had never won there. And that playoff win.
Times?
Yeah. And that playoff win was their first win in the Garden. And then, of course, that extends to, because the playoff run went Boston, Buffalo, Calgary. Mm-hmm. And when Willie Plett was playing for the Flames, there's the famous story about how Glenn was like screaming and Plett took his hand and covered up his eye to mock Glenn. And there's just some great stuff. And then, of course, Plett got traded here. So,
yeah. And I think I ended up cutting because there was a scene where Plett and Sonmore were going at each other. And I think I ended up cutting some of that out, too.
That's it. Yeah.
I mean, you're at 2.5 hours. You got to cut some things at some point,
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Age, got anything else?
No, I mean, I do want to pass along. I got a slap shot in time for my dad. It was a Christmas gift. I want to say a year or two ago now. He absolutely adores it. I haven't been able to wrestle it out of his bookshelf yet for me to actually read, but it's at some point I'm going to sneak in there.
You're going to make me cry.
No.
Thank you.
Well, he loves it, so I just want to pass that along. It's a terrific book.
That hits me in the heart. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I deeply regret, because I didn't care about sports at that time. I started to follow sports in 78. So I deeply regret the fact that I never got to at least one game there too.
Right. I wasn't old enough, so I'm the same way. I'm like, I would have loved to. I mean, I've been to the Civic Center, but not for a Saints game. I was too young.
That was a glorious dump. I loved that building. It was a glorious dump. I saw college games there. I was at the Scarta Hit the Post game, 89 NCAA title game against Harvard. The Gophers lost in OT, and of course, the famous story is Scarta, and he did hit the pipe. I saw countless high school hockey tournament games there. I love that place. High school
wrestling, I think. I vaguely remember being there for like a KDWB star party or something. Like
Once they took away the clear boards, though, it was done.
Yeah, the Moose did that, right?
For revenue, so they could put advertising. But I went to like 2 or 3 games when the Stars left and the Moose played there. I couldn't take it. It was like a funeral dirge. Everything was a reminder that we had lost the North Stars, and they didn't have the clear boards. And I'm like, I'm done. And then the Moose played some games downtown here as well, and then they moved and became a Jets farm club. So, hey, great stuff. So, again, Dan, and by the way, stand up. What's the shirt? Met Center?
I'm trying to see if it was on camera.
Yeah, it was. Oh, yeah, it's a great that's a great shirt. That's a great shirt. Love that place. Dan, so where can people find the documentary? And just as importantly, where can they find your work? And I know that you are incredibly active also on Twitter and other social
Sometimes too much.
media. Well, you know what?
Never too much.
You know what? You're okay. So I'm just gonna
tweets in the morning.
I was gonna say I'm just gonna make I'm going to say something about your tweets because they are reflective, and I'm guessing we're around the same age. I'm guessing older, but we're around the same age. Friday nights, a few cocktails in.
I don't know what you're talking about. Teachers don't do that sort of thing.
Sometimes you get on Twitter and you're like, and then you wake up and you're like, I didn't really tweet that, did I?
Speaking of which, can I wanted to do this. I wanted to thank you guys for having me back on the airwaves, the Score North airwaves here, because there was the infamous 2020 Randy Moss trivia incident where you guys were you guys had just switched to a digital platform. Okay. We're at home on the pandemic. Nobody's going anywhere. Everything's closed. My wife and I were planning on going to see the Eagles for my it was literally my night of my birthday, right?
Oh, God.
And my wife and I, we can't go anywhere, so we're celebrating at home. And I'm like, oh, those Score North guys, I want to go support them with this Randy Moss thing on Facebook, right? And I get on there, and to your credit, you guys brought me on, probably trying to help me out because it was early on in all this. And like I said, it was my birthday.
Yeah.
And you guys brought me on, and you were talking about a Twins game, and I was talking about a Timberwolves game, and you were like, yeah, that's not what I'm talking about, Dan. And I was like, oh. And it was really awkward, and I've always wanted to apologize. So Phil, if you're listening, I apologize, but I appreciate what you were trying to do. So.
Well, thank you, and I don't recall it one bit. So it's.
I'm sure I remember it more than you guys do. It's bothered me for a long time.
Absolutely fine. So where again can people find your work and your presence on the socials?
So the documentaries are on my YouTube channel. It's Whenesota, one word, Whenesota, and my books are on Amazon. The History of Heartbreak and Slapshot in Time. Dan Whenesota.
Awesome stuff, man. Great work, and yeah. The last part, I just watched it. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, the entire thing is, but you can take it slowly as well because they're each just such in-depth looks. Dan, we appreciate your time. I'm sure that you'll have another documentary or book because there's plenty of calamity that will always come down the pike here. AJ, thanks much. We will see you next week on Judd's Hockey Show.